All right, greetings everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jason Muñiz, and I am here with the UC Berkeley High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. I'd like to welcome all the ethnic studies educators in the space to joining us today. We have a great conversations scheduled for you all to enjoy and hopefully learn from today. So I'm happy to be hosting this and happy to be convening this space with you all. Today we'll be speaking with Kyle Beckham, who works at UC Berkeley's teacher education program, and I'll give him a little bit of a chance to share his background and his relationship with ethnic studies with you all in just a moment or two. But for now, I'd like to sort of move us into our protocol because we have a lot of things we'd like to get accomplished in not a whole lot of time today. So let's just jump right in. All right. Let's first start off our time together with a very brief but meaningful for us land acknowledgement. UC Berkeley sits on Huichin, which is the ancestral land of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who are the successors of the sovereign Verona band of Alameda, who have resided on this land since time immemorial. As the first federal land grant university in what is now California, UC Berkeley benefited from the taking of Ohlone ancestral land during the early years of statehood. Today, the Muwekma Ohlone and the Confederated Villages of Lishan, among others, continue to organize for federal recognition, revive cultural practices, reintroduce models of sustainable land stewardship, and protect sacred locations like the West Berkeley Shell Mound. Our organization commits to supporting these Indigenous-led efforts, reinforcing accurate and healing instruction, and correcting our past work that perpetuates harm and misunderstanding. And of course, we know that a land acknowledgement is just the beginning of that work. And some of the work that we're hoping to foster today will perhaps make some of the other things that we know are important in terms of recognizing the land that we are situated on and some of the work that we need to do as a community a little bit easier as we talk about bringing ethnic studies into our classrooms. Our organization, again, is just a part of that work. And for the many folks who are in the space today who haven't joined our meetings before, I'd like to share a little bit about our organization because this presentation today is being put on by the UC Berkeley High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. All right, and these are some of our goals. This is a work of a collaboration. This organization is a work of collaboration between three different units at UC Berkeley: the American Cultural Center, the Department of Ethnic Studies, and the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project. And our goals are really a few, but these are the main goals that you see articulated on the screen. We're hoping to support ethnic studies educators with developing their content and developing the pedagogies that can be used in their classroom. We have a lot of access to a lot of different resources at UC Berkeley. And so we want to be able to provide access to those resources to all the educators who are looking to develop or refine their existing ethnic studies courses. And of course, we have a convention of scholars here, a convention of a lot of different educators in some different spaces. And so we really like to think of this as an opportunity to expand some professional networks of all of you as ethnic studies educators. So the names and the people who are in these spaces, we hope that you take note of them. And we hope that in future sessions, we'll have a little bit more of an opportunity to exchange ideas and communicate with each other. Today, our format is not lending itself to that, but we do actually provide other opportunities to have a lot of interaction amongst the people in our initiative. Right. So a little bit about what we're doing. Again, this is the program that we have going. And before we get started today, I do want to take an opportunity to share that this is an ongoing sort of project. We have a lot of different events, including the one workshop that we're doing today with a conversation with our guest, Kyle Beckham. But of course, there are other things that we also put on. And I want to share very briefly just some of the other opportunities that we have for ethnic studies educators coming up. So for example, a week from today, we'll be meeting with a colleague of Kyle's from the past, Art Nelson Concordia, who will be talking about how can districts and schools successfully implement their ethnic studies courses. And Art Nelson, who worked in San Francisco and who currently works in Santa Barbara Unified School District, doing their program coordination for ethnic studies, has a lot to say on that. And we're happy to have him share what he knows. And then similarly, in the summer, June 10th to 14th, we actually have a workshop week, which is actually very exciting. It's our second one of these. Last year, we did a workshop week similar to the one we have in mind this year, where we brought in a bunch of scholars, people who are teaching ethnic studies together in a space. gave them access to some of the many resources here at UC Berkeley, the Ethnic Studies Library, conversations with the folks from the Third World Liberation Front who may be working or have relationships with the university, and putting folks together to do a lot of generating of ideas and some best instructional practices. A lot of conversations and relationship building came out of that, and we're holding that space again this summer. So registration for that is coming up soon, and the registration for Art Nelson's conversation is actually available now, and I'll make sure that we'll share that link coming up. But that's a little bit about what we have going on in mind for you all. And before we get too far afield, I want to take a moment just to talk about today. Now, today we're going to be holding a scholar conversation. And for those of you who have been here with us in the past, you know that we like to spend some time in a fireside chat format. So for about 30 minutes or so, our guest and I will be speaking, answering some questions, having a conversation about some of the things that relate to our theme for the day. As you as participants will remain muted during that time, and we're hoping that while you're observing or listening to our conversation, you can take a moment to raise any questions or add any comments into the Zoom chat. And hopefully definitely do that, because we're going to make space specifically for you to have your questions answered by our guest for about 15 minutes or so after we have our fireside chat. So at roughly about, I want to say like 4:40, 4:45, we'll stop and give some space for you all to have your questions answered. Now, in terms of educator discussions, typically we have like a whole half hour set aside and a whole meeting again a week later to have conversations about and respond to and process what we've discussed in our session today. Because we're coming up on spring break and because we have another speaker scheduled a week from today, we decided to put off that discussion as a whole session, but we will make space just to give y'all some time to talk about and sort of consider what we've been doing today after our time. So roughly about 5:30, our time with Kyle will have ended, and then I'll keep the space open so we can do some processing and talking about what we've learned and maybe what some next steps might be. But again, we intend to have a broader conversation a little bit further out. So with that, I want to give folks in the space a little bit of opportunity to have their voices heard. So please, if you wouldn't mind doing a brief little check-in on the chat, responding to just a couple of different prompts. First, in the Zoom chat, please go ahead and share your name and pronouns. And then once you're done, take a moment and consider how you want to respond to this check-in question. When controversial or divisive conversations come up during ethnic studies instruction, what might students need in order to create a sense of healing? So I'll leave that on the screen and give folks about a minute or two to check in, name, pronouns, but then we'll see what your answer to that question is, and that'll set us up for our conversation with our guest. Feel free to go ahead and drop those answers in the chat. Thank you. Students feeling heard. Protocols with norms for sure. Yeah, I'm hearing space to be heard, feel like they're heard. Students feeling the need to process their feelings, absolutely. Safe space, room for multiple perspectives. Validation. I'm saying feeling heard a bunch of times. Positive intent. Space to disagree without judgment. Space and permission to have emotions. Great. Great. All right. And take a moment as you're entering in your responses here, and there are plenty of them. Great. Thank you all for contributing and having your voice sort of enter the chat. Take a moment to sort of look at what some of your peers have said as well. All right. All right, fantastic. Thank you all for sharing. Thank you for introducing yourself to the people who are in this space today. Feel free to take full advantage of this chat. So as our guest and I are having a conversation, you will be asked to remain muted. However, use the chat. Put your questions in there. I promise we're going to make some space for whatever questions, whatever comments you have in the chat to be brought into our conversation. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to as many of those as possible. So don't be shy about letting your ideas and your voice come out. So with that, I'm going to then move us ahead to introduce our guest. So joining us today at our High School Ethnic Studies Initiative Scholar Conversation is Mr. Kyle Beckham. And Kyle will be introducing himself hopefully in just a second. We'll get to his background and how he comes into this work. However, I did want to share that we have a bit of a focus question today that relates to that check-in. And we're going to talk about as a primary part of our conversation, how do we create healing spaces in response to some of those controversial topics that we know are coming up in ethnic studies courses that we have sort of baked into the design of what we will be talking about that are coming up organically in our communities? How do we create healing spaces when those conversations come up? And sometimes there's heated conversations, sometimes there's acrimony and discord. What do we do with that in our instructional space as an effective and thoughtful ethnic studies teachers? So with that, I'd like to kind of stop sharing my screen and bring into the conversation our guest, Kyle. Kyle, thank you so much for coming in here and joining us today. I sincerely appreciate your taking the time to meet with our teachers, to meet with all the folks who are invested in ethnic studies in the Bay Area and across the state of California. If you wouldn't mind, for those in our audience who are really unfamiliar with you or your background, feel free to unmute yourself and then please share a little bit about yourself, the work you do, and how you came to have experience with working with high school ethnic studies.
Greetings, everyone. See some familiar faces, and it's good to see new faces here as well. I am in my 20th year as an educator. I did my student teaching in the fall of 2002, Providence, Rhode Island, at a school called Central High School. And that was a really instructive space for me. It shares a space with another school called Classical High School. And it was instructive in that those two schools were kind of diametrically opposed towards the outcomes that were expected of the students. Central was the school for kids who just kind of in the neighborhood, and Classical was the test-in school. And every morning you would see kids go into one building and another group of kids go into another. And it was this kind of sense of kind of written into the landscape, this deep sense of kind of fundamental and semi-permanent injustice of this that really motivated me to be the best kind of teacher that I could be from the very beginning of my career. I taught for a year at a school in Oakland that no longer exists called the School for Social Justice and Community Development. Its intention was to kind of build on a community school model where kids who had an activist orientation could come develop that activist orientation and make it manifest in the community around the school. It was also kind of had the bad luck of being a school that came about during the takeover by the state of OUSD. And so it kind of withered on the vine from external and internal complication. I spent the next 10 years teaching in San Francisco Unified at a project-based continuation high school called Downtown. And Downtown is probably the most important educational space of my life. It's where I've learned the most about how to be a teacher, how to be a learner. I served students who were pushed out of schools for a variety of different reasons. And when you teach in an environment like that, you have often have a lot of freedom to teach what you want. And I was lucky to work with teachers who had, more of an activist orientation to the work, who had an ethnic studies background often. And we wanted to do cool stuff to get kids to want to actually come to school. And by working at Downtown, I had the opportunity in 2006 to join an exploratory committee of about launching or investigating the possibility of ethnic studies in San Francisco Unified School District. That was led by Dr. Allison Tintianco Kubalis, who has been a close collaborator of mine ever since then. So through that work, we ran an initial pilot um, developed some curriculum, found out a lot of things that didn't work. But one thing that we did kind of coalesce around was the need to institutionalize ethnic studies by getting the district to have some skin in the game, of actually getting the district to financially commit to supporting the pilot at the minimum. And then our goal was then to get the district to financially support ethnic studies across at least an offering of a course at every single high school in San Francisco. We passed two board resolutions during that time, and kind of created the foundation for the ethnic study work that continues today. So Art Nelson, who's going to be here next week, was a close collaborator of mine. I met my wife, Amy Ritchell, through this work. So this has been a huge part of my life. My adult life is really kind of colored deeply by struggling for ethnic studies, of wrangling with the complexities of the work. And now I'm a teacher educator at UC Berkeley. I did doctoral work at Stanford. Boo. And then, so now my task is to bring new teachers into the work with a level of preparation, focus, and organization that I think is necessary, that I myself had to kind of find via, just the doing it as I went. So my job, and I think for myself, is to get people who are passionate about the work, who are willing to do the very grindy, unglamorous, hidden stuff that is the foundation for what I think are really strong ethnic studies programs. And for them to then kind of replicate that, but really doing this from a perspective of that, ethnic studies is an essential part of, I think, how schools should be. Which brings me to the question for today, right? So how can we build healing spaces? And I like this question. However, one thing I don't like about it is that this is a question I think needs to be asked to the entire school community, to the entire district itself. And I've seen over this, my longer kind of path in ethnic studies, is that ethnic studies becomes the kind of catch-all social justice class that allows other teachers to abdicate doing the more difficult work of engaging with these kinds of questions, of thinking about what it means for a math class to be a healing space, for there to be the possibility of controversial material across the curriculum, and then also thinking about just this notion of what it means for school to be a healing space, right? Because it is both a healing and a harming space. And that is also one of the things that I think we have to kind of really think about and talk about, and potentially have to confront people who are engaged in harmful practice. But we have to really push back against this notion that the difficult stuff is only in ethnic studies, or the hard stuff or the dark stuff only lives in ethnic studies. I think that is an injustice to the work. And it also causes ethnic studies to kind of lose its focus on what it really is, which is primarily a class where we need to make sense about race, racialization, and racism. That doesn't mean that other things do not intersect deeply with that. But when it becomes the catch-all class, it becomes also something that it's like, it's what people of color often, and women, right, and other kind of marginalized groups have to experience, right? There's this additional labor that is kind of put upon them so that other people can do things that are easy for them. And I think that that's something that we need to really be thinking about, how this can be a question that is explored across the whole school community. That we should really say that, like, there is no space in the school where it isn't the possibility of healing, connection, and really deep, meaningful, lasting learning is not. There is no classroom where that is not possible, where it cannot happen. And so I think that there are some very specific things that schools can and should be doing. One of these would be kind of deprioritizing the march through content, and thinking about content as the thing that is driving the work that we're doing. So what ends up happening is, when we center the content, all the other things are not thought of as equally as important. And in a lot of ways, we must think of what this question asks of us as content itself to be taught. And if we're going to be thinking of how do we create these healing spaces, we need to dedicate the same amount of time, effort, energy, thought collaboration, vision, consistency to these questions as we do to the curricular questions of the what is to be taught. For me, this is a what is to be taught question as well. Just as we should be learning about the histories of communities of color, centering those histories in the ethnic studies space, we need to be also bringing students into these conversations so that we can address some of these things that came up in the chat around agency, around belonging, around being heard. And these are questions that we should be asking students. What do we need to do to make it so that you feel that you are heard? What do we need to make it so that you feel like this is a space for you, so that you want to come here? And we need to be thinking about these questions constantly, not just at the beginning of the year when we do our kind of traditional, community building. We need to be thinking of community building as an ongoing process that is the foundation for all of the what that we teach. That this needs to be thought of just as deeply. It needs to be something that is constantly integrated into the way that we plan, the way that we collaborate, and the way that we envision long-term what we want schools to be.
So and that really resonates for me because like it's really interesting as I work with a lot of educators thinking about their ethnic studies courses, and I'm like, well, what do we teach? Like what goes into an ethnic studies teach and like class? And really the idea around the how it should be taught is like the pedagogy is a little de-emphasized because maybe it's just like an inclination of teachers to really worry about like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about on Tuesday morning in class, as opposed to like, how will I build the space to have conversations? Which kind of brings me around one of the questions I had in mind to first talk about around pedagogical moves, right? Like if you're an ethnic studies teacher and you either taught a course or you're and you're refining it, or you're thinking about what to do as you're building that ethnic studies course that you may or may not have experience having constructed, what can you do to sort of prepare yourself ahead of time to have those conversations? Because so much of the work is before you get with the students, right? So what can we do to sort of build our own capacity to set us up for success in those conversations before they happen, knowing that some of them are going to be just inherently controversial?
Great question. I'm going to put a link to the work of Judy Pace from USF in the chat. I think this is a really useful framework for thinking about kind of controversial issues generally. And this is a framework where it's asking us to pre-plan. And I think what ends up happening is a lot of folks like something will happen in the class and then it's like we have to respond. So we're in this reactive space. But so those of you who know me or have been a student of mine, like I'm a big understanding by design person. And there's this 3-part process for understanding by design, which is that you need to identify what success looks like first. You need to identify like what is the end point. Then you need to identify the markers along the way, kind of the assessments that you're going to be doing to see if people are meeting this end. And then we plan the specifics of how we're going to get there. And I think like doing that meta kind of thinking for yourself of what you want, right? And this question of what do I want? What does a healthy classroom community look like? What does a healing classroom look like? And really sitting down, articulating that for yourself. And then saying this is a kind of a guidepost or a guide star for me. And then thinking, okay, what do I need to do to get my students and my classroom space to this? Maybe I don't have the capacity to reach this goal just by myself. Then who do I need to reach out to build those kinds of capacities? But I think before we get into that day to day, right? And that's what we want to do as teachers. We want to feel like, okay, I have this this is gonna be the lesson, right? But really thinking about that bigger question of like, what does success in this kind of core area look like? How do we think of like what a healthy classroom requires? Like, what does it require of us? What does it require of our students? And how are we articulating that to them? How are we modeling that? And I think that this another thing that I would really recommend to people as they're building programs is like slower is probably better, right? You're not going to get to all of the material, but then really thinking about like how these kinds of things can be set up as a conversation in which the students feel like they are contributing to something more than like, okay, we put our things up at the beginning of the year and we never revisit them. But planning, like sitting there planning like we plan with our lessons of thinking about I want to work on this very specific skill with my students around, um, managing the emotions that come with a difficult conversation. Making lesson sequences, having reflection on those things, having conversation around those things without the specifics of a controversial issue, just so that the students have frameworks, structures that they can talk about, access, and be redirected to. I think that's another important thing, is thinking about how you need to, plan before we teach, and then practice before we assess, and then really make sure that we are assessing. That's another thing that I think people really need to be thinking about, is how can we, and should we be assessing the health of our classrooms? And then if we do an honest assessment, kind of the checklist of simple things, right? For me, a big marker of a healthy classroom, one that has the capacity to be a healing space, is, do all the kids know each other's names?
Mm.
That's a simple question.
Why is that an
And it,
indicator of a healthy classroom to your mind?
because it means to me that the teacher has really made it a point that you will know everyone in this room. You may not have to like them, but you will know their name. Ideally, you'll know more than their name, right? And that little bit of connection matters, instead of, hey, you, or what's your name? And it's March. To me, is like, that's a shocking kind of thing, that these kids have spent 100+ days together and they don't know each other's name. So I think, like, on that level of articulating what does a healthy environment look like, that means then you have the capacity to maybe handle some of the controversial stuff, right?
Mm.
But I think also, and that's what I put the Judy Pace framework up here, is that I think there are some really good steps of how to go about this slowly, judiciously, and to really think about, beyond just for yourself, also thinking about how you can involve your students in these conversations and make this an ongoing thing, so that when you need to engage in a process, there's a process that they're familiar with, they've practiced, they've reflected on, they've assessed themselves on how well they are doing this, right? And this is all, I don't think that this is like in lieu of important historical or literary or sociological information. Like, this is content. This is the students' lives, their experiences becoming the content. And they can be like, yeah, we talk deeply about how we feel about things, or what we think a sense of fairness is, or kids will always say on the thing, like, be respectful, like, respect one another.
Mhm.
And I think, like, really peeling that back and asking, like, what does that actually look like for you? What does that look like for the other people in the classroom? Can you articulate to the other people, like, so and so's, sorry, I see my former student Alicia. Can I articulate Alicia's vision? Like, what does like respect look like for her? And if kids can talk like that, then okay, maybe now we can start to move into what it means to be able to handle some of these controversial and charged issues. Um, I think another thing that we have to, you know, traverse is the real diversity in the classroom. And I'm saying this is beyond racial and ethnic diversity, but just like the diversity of experience, right? That there's going to be kids who have very reactionary views and have had very reactionary upbringings, right? Whose, like, whole orientation towards the world may be antithetical to mine as a teacher, right? Who may believe that, like, things that we see as injustice are acts of justice. This is the reality of the classroom, right? And we need to think about when those moments arise, like, is the classroom space able to uh, create a space where this person who may feel, you as a teacher may feel like, it's like, wow, they are way out there, that
Mhm.
some change may be possible, that they may be led to something that is more justice oriented, fairness oriented. um, but I think it's also, we have to model that for our students in order for them to be able to say, like, okay, this is someone who I disagree with, like, fundamentally, and really entertaining, like, okay, what if there is a fundamental disagreement? Then how do we come to a space where we've leveraged the stuff that we've done before, that allows that maybe fundamental disagreement not to be something that becomes uh an un an unbridgeable gap.
Mhm.
And then I think the even more difficult question is, right, like maybe we do have an unbridgeable gap in the classroom. Does
And
that
does that mean-
prevent further future movement around connecting, around building, around doing the work of learning also?
Right, and that kind of is like the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is like we can prepare and we can set ourselves up for success. We can sort of be thoughtful around like the pace of our planning and anticipating these moments. But at the end of the day, the moments come, and sometimes when once that conflict and the discord really happens, we find ourselves in a classroom space where we're hoping to create a safe space, but there's been discord, there's been division that's happened here, and for teachers who are confronted with that moment in the offing or have done this class before and know that hey, that's going to happen, whatever your best plans are. I think that for folks who haven't done this, it's definitely like an anxious point. It's a point where like I don't know if I'm ready to teach ethnic studies, because what happens when the kids are in this space today and they're arguing over this topic that that is not an easy one for adults to wrap their heads around. So I think one thing that I find, I'm hoping that we can get some wisdom from you to share here, as being able to support teachers with what you do after those moments happen, and how do we build that healing space, because things like life is busy doing what it's going to do, and so here we are with discord. What can we do to repair and sort of move forward in a way that feels productive and authentic?
So I think again, this goes back to the like, how can we do our best to slow things down? And let's assume that we can do that, or if we cannot, right? I think that there are some things where there's going to be like, what are the real bright lines of like this has gone too far, right? And that needs to be real clear. That you may have to temporarily exclude someone because they have done something that is absolutely destructive to the space. Um, but I use the word temporary
Mm,
because I think that you need to also be thinking about that when these moments do happen, where maybe there's a kid for whatever reason is a troll and that they need to be temporarily excluded. What do they need to do in order to re-enter? Is that clear to them? Right? So that there is a space for kind of redemption, ownership of what they've done, right? And I know that we can get into it's like this is an infinite, well, what if they do this? What if they do that? But I think just generally mapping out, like in your mind, if this were to happen, I need to exclude a kid for whatever reason because they have crossed a bright line. I think that if you are really clear, you must be very clear on what these bright lines are, why they are bright lines, right? And what happens if they're crossed, and then the process for re-entering, right? So that you're not gonna, it's not gonna work 100% of the time, but I think like with transparency, clarity, and then a sense of kind of asking the offender to reflect on the why of what they were doing, and then giving them a space to maybe articulate the why in a way that isn't trolling. Again, this may be like you have to be the editor as a teacher and be like, I can't let this, this doesn't feel sufficient to me. But if that's the case, then again, we need to really think about, have we articulated clearly what that reentry looks like? Um, so I think like there are many restorative models that work. I think we have to also think about, we can't just like slap this on, like, okay, I've got this model, unless we're going to, again, like really teach and work with our kids towards it. Um, and I think if we're doing that kind of work as we go, when these controversial things come into the classroom, hopefully it's not happening early on. But again, I think there's some pre-planning you can do from the very beginning of like that's that goal oriented of really doing some of the scenario work for yourself. I'm reluctant to do kind of the like do the 1, 2, 3 step,
mhm.
regardless of the specifics of the situation, right? Because there's a lot of complexities that happen from class to class, period to period in the same school. And so the process for reentry healing may look different from period to period, but I think that really being clear on what the bright lines are, what happens if those bright lines are transgressed, how uh, restoration can happen, but then also giving a space for the person who has been hurt. Let's say that it's a more kind of one-way situation, that they also have a space to really articulate their feelings Um, and they may need to leave the space too to do that.
Right, and
So,
that's something that sits with me a bunch because I'm just thinking back to my own practice, and a lot of like the focus whenever there is like a sort of divisive moment is like the agent of that divisiveness, like whoever's the person who said or did something that was a transgression. But then the what I want to spend some time thinking about, and I'm not sure that I did the best job of this when I was in the classroom, was how do we be mindful of the students who are the ones who are ones who are harmed by it, because now they're asked to invite somebody into the space to give them a second chance to re-articulate themselves, but I don't feel like I want to give that person a second chance because that person hurt me or said something that like I'm not okay with that, regardless of how many chances Mr. Beckham gives such and such for being in the space. I'm not okay with that. And that's real for students because the things that we're inviting, the conversation that we're inviting are personal. They couldn't be more personal. And we're doing this as a part of school. And now I have to sit here with this person who crossed me in a way that I'm just not all right with. How do we make that person feel um safe or welcome in this space, knowing that that's not their bad?
yeah, so I mean, I think that's a great question. It's a really challenging thing. I want to say that uh, again, I think going back to what has been put in the chat, the just being heard for a lot of those kids and having the space to say what has happened to them um, can, I think, open the door to it. But I think we also have to be like, this is going to take some time for some of these things. And they may never actually be able to get over that. We have to entertain that possibility as well. But then we have to think about, okay, so then how can we arrange the space so that that doesn't become a flashpoint? And then how do we provide strategies with kind of the target or the victim to kind of manage some of the, justified emotions that they have? Um, and and then thinking about, okay, revisiting with the provocateur, perpetrator of the harm, to check in and be like, what do you think you can do? Should you do something? Um, and I can't say again, like this is going to work 100% because you may have kids who, for a variety of reasons, like to do some of these things. They
Mhm.
like to be the provocateur, or there's reputation at stake that they're just not going to be able to do that. So thinking about then how can you manage some of these kinds of reputational things to where maybe it's not going to be very public, but there's some signal that they recognize what has been done. It's not a guarantee. And I think that that's part of what I wish I could say is that this stuff is guaranteed. But I think it goes a long way because a lot of kids don't have teachers who are going to be like, I'm going to check in with you pretty regularly about this, right? Like, I'm going to make sure that we go back to the process. I'm going to make sure that you feel heard because I want to do my best to bridge that gap because we're going to have to be in the space together.
Mhm.
Um, but and I think just saying, I want to make sure that you feel safe and I will do my best to make sure that these kinds of things do not happen. And you have to also say, like, I am an imperfect, flawed person. But
Mhm.
I think leveling with kids like that, right? Talking to them in those kinds of ways can do some of that work of opening them to the possibility of bridging that gap. But I think it's also you have to have a similar kind of conversation with the perpetrator.
I'm realizing how fast our time is clicking by. So I want to make sure that we have some space for our teachers to have their questions added. So I'm going to see if I can go through here and just see what folks have said. First, a question about the slides. Yeah, we'll make sure that all that stuff is going to be shared when we reach out to you all. I guess sort of more like a comment is like Mike has mentioned that admin needs to support some of this effort too, and lest their parents get upset. What's your take on the role that administrators have in sort of supporting this sort of work? And as you mentioned, not just in the ethnic studies classroom, but in our classrooms in general. What kind of support? What does support look like to your mind from that corner?
Sorry, I was.
Yeah,
Can
no
you just
problem.
repeat that?
Like
What
administrator
I
support.
was
What is
reading the questions in the chat. The I have the questions up. Which one was this? This was the
So from Mike Espinosa, admin needs to support lest the parents get upset. So if we're thinking about some of the challenges, what does administrative support look like?
yeah. So I think on that question is like this goes back to that school wide discussion that needs to be happening. And I think you need to kind of communicate very, like, transparency is an asset here of being like, this is the process, this is how it's going. And you're not going to be able to please 100% of everyone with these things. But what I think you can do is be like, this is what's happening. This is what will happen if there is kind of a blowout or a deep kind of disagreement. These are the things that we're going to do. This is why we're doing them. If you have research that you could connect to it, I think like those are the kinds of things like, yeah, you can get somebody who maybe is like an ultra MAGA high right wing, like no matter what you do, but they're not the majority, not close to the majority. And I think we have to be careful about organizing our responses around them because there's a whole lot of people I think would benefit from just the kind of regular communication about what's happening in the classrooms, the clarity of the processes, right? And really saying, I want to invite you parents into seeing how these things work, which would be also another thing that I think is important for admin to do is to gather data and examples of success, right? And testimonies from kids who have kind of gone through some of this stuff and being like, we are going to show you what this looks like. Again, will that work for every parent in every context? No. But I think that that kind of level of transparency will disarm some people, right? To where you can say, like, we want your kid to engage in some of this stuff. It may be uncomfortable for them. It may challenge them. It may push them. And that's part of what we want. But we also want to make it so that, we want them to be able to interrogate themselves, interrogate the world around them, and to do it as safely as possible. And this is how we are trying to build this. I think about my own experience as a student. Teachers being transparent like that or administrators, I can't imagine. Like my whole teaching, like student experience would be wildly different if that level of transparency, of honesty, of openness. Again, you're gonna get people who, no matter what, especially when it comes to ethnic studies, are gonna just go on the attack. But I think that the way you counter those bad faith, highly ideological attacks is by the evidence of success, the evidence of the careful planning, the careful consideration, the saying we are going to touch on some controversial things. This is our process for how we're going to do that. This is how we are going to select materials. This is how we're going to structure conversations and interactions. This is how we're going to manage disagreement. I mean, as a parent right now, if I receive that kind of thing from a teacher, I would be like, this person, even if they were really conservative, I would be like, okay, I may not like this person, but I can trust that my student has a space to where they can say what needs to be said in a way that's not going to get them into this, like, they're going to be a target necessarily.
I want to go back to the question in chat a little bit because there's a couple things that I want to sort of address. First, you mentioned restorative justice, and so it has one of the teachers here. Do restorative justice models work with a student that goes across that bright line? And I think tied into that, are there videos of master teachers modeling some things like RJ circles or like just some of the discussions or strategies that you're mentioning? Because I think that sometimes, like for a lot of our educators that I work with anyway, they got to see it to be able to make it make sense.
So I don't have that level of specificity. I think this is one of these things like you can probably find those examples out there. There's a couple of scholars I think would be worth reaching out to who could probably provide that. I don't have access to those things. I will put so there's Dr. Farima Khorshid, who some of you may know. She's at University of San Francisco as well as Judy Pace. She does a lot of work on kind of healing-centered pedagogy. She's mainly elementary, but she's a really dynamic person, has a lot of access to resources and teachers who are really committed to this work. She may be able to provide you with some of that. If she may not, then she probably can connect you to someone who would have that. Another person is Dr. Sean Jin, right? I'm gonna put an article of his in the chat as well. These are people I want to say email them,
Mhm.
right? They want to have you all reaching out and asking for these kinds of things so that they want to do this work. They want to bring the stuff in. So I think like those are two good people to start with in terms of trying to get access to these more shareable resources. I know there's also a broader just network of restorative justice researchers, practitioners, and I know like Oakland Unified, San Francisco Unified have, they've committed some pretty substantial resources to these things. I think it's worth kind of reaching out to those too and just making connections with people who are kind of tasked with that. If you are outside of those districts, it may be worth seeing if you can do some field trip stuff to
Yeah.
come and see it. Um, so those are Berkeley Unified. A lot of the Bay Area schools I think have and districts have committed to this. It's just the sharing of kind of video thing is a another level of
Mhm.
access that I do not have.
Sure. That's fair, and I appreciate your sharing some ideas around who we might reach out to, because that's, again, this is an ongoing process for us. So yeah, I'd be happy to entertain some conversation with some more folks as well. Going back to our chat, we have Marissa Ferjan Sweat, who's asked sort of a longer question. So I'm just going to read it and give you time to process as well, because I know you see it. In our focus groups with students to solicit feedback on how to make the new ethnic studies course as valuable for them as possible. Some of our students have asked us to give the option of time or for opting out of elements of the class that ask them to share personal information and experiences. How have you addressed that tension between efforts to create this new kind of safe, open space in school with kids who perhaps have deep reticence to enter that space and be vulnerable around classmates who may not feel incentivized to trust or engage with? Great question.
That's an awesome question. I think that opting out is something that you should say, yeah, we can't. I mean, you don't want to force kids to share some things that they don't want to share that are highly personal. But I think that there should be kind of an expectation that you don't necessarily have to share everything with your classmates, but I would like for you to share it with me. And in that, there can be some sorry, confidentiality, and they're still engaging in the kinds of thinking that you would want them to engage in. But I think that that goes back to like really being assessing the health of the community. Like, yeah, we there are things that kids we should have to be very careful about what we're asking them to share. And I think that that's also a conversation to maybe begin a year with, to reflect on, and to think about like when is opting out okay, when is it not, and when might it be worth trying. I think that just that the kids knowing that the expectation is that we come to share, but also really thinking about what it is that we're asking them to share, why, and towards what goals does that sharing help us accomplish. Because I also don't want this ethnic studies to be like a trauma dump place, right? Like, oh well, this is the safe space, so of course we just pour it all out here.
Yeah, this becomes
Um,
the saddest class that you can walk into
right,
all
and
day
I've
long.
had students like to high schoolers be like, this class is depressing, and I'm like, oh man, I don't want that. Like sometimes, yeah, it's gonna be depressing, but that's not the default shouldn't be like this class is depressing. It should be like this is a space where um, growth is what is happening. And I think like if you are really, about the sharing thing, is just thinking about what growth looks like, of asking kids what might they be comfortable sharing, what what are their boundaries in terms of sharing. And I think like you can work with kids to get that kind of answer. Um, and there's another question about like the mandatory nature of this. I think that that complicates things, right? When you don't have an opt-in. And I
Mhm.
think that that's related to what I'm saying here, is that, you're going to have some good faith opting out, and you're going to have bad faith opting out. But I think like there's things just asking about like having a variety of options in which the kids can engage with what you're doing, so that there is some sense of choice, right? And then it's saying like, well, I've given you four choices. Well, what would you potentially do that would allow you to achieve this learning goal or this end or this demonstration of understanding? Um, so I know I'm going to say I'm not a fan of mandated ethnic studies. I wrote an article about it, and I think it's kind of counterproductive if a community doesn't want it and doesn't want to sustain it and put the resources into it to kind of force kids in that community to go through it. Uh, but it's here, right? So I think some of this, how do healing spaces look like in the mandatory class? I think it's going to be complicated, but I think that the core is the same,
Mhm.
and the core of the intention being the same. Of right, like that, I want you to have a voice here. It's okay that we disagree. These are our bright lines. If there's a consistent and persistent violation, here's our process for this. So I think that we can meet some of this with the level of kind of clarity and transparency and organization that doesn't exist in other mandatory spaces, right? Like there are other mandated spaces that kids go through that somehow they're able to make progress in. But I think that this is also an opportunity to maybe redefine what a mandatory class can look like.
Mm.
And in that, maybe we can get some movement, right? It's all probabilistic here. Um, but I think that the going slow and saying, I want to hear what you have to say, and really believing that is going to get more kids than not, because I don't think that that is the default way in which kids experience school.
So this is the part where I'm going to disappoint a whole bunch of folks who have questions here lined up, and that was inevitable. Expect and accept a little bit of non-closure is the mantra that I have adopted in education, because you never can close the door on the conversation gracefully. But one thing I would like to sort of close us out with is, in your capacity as someone who works in teacher education, and supporting that, and knowing that this is a mandatory class. This is now a graduation requirement class, and for better or for worse, it's there. What kinds of what kind of problems of practice do you think, like a community of educators like this, who are convening, who are trying to wrap their head around how to do ethnic studies in a thoughtful way? What should we be in conversation about, and how can we be and better support to each other to get this work done that is obviously very nuanced and challenging in parts?
I mean, I think we should continue to ask the question that brought us here together today, right? Like this is a core question. I think that really thinking of challenging the notion that we need to be covering content is another thing.
Mhm.
I think that teachers should be coming together and really thinking about how they can create a sense of ownership for themselves over this thing that they're going to teach, of how there's going to be like what is the range of variability, right? That it may look different in one class than another, but that this is still within kind of the acceptable range of what we understand is ethnic studies. Um, and I think that really, again, articulating what does success look like
Mm.
at the end of the unit, at the end of the course, and how do we consistently assess kids and help them meet these goals that we have for them? And then how do we bring kids into feeling a sense of ownership over the course too, through self-reflection, through self-assessment. And I think we need to reclaim some of these kind of dirty words in education for ourselves to make them liberatory. I think data collection can be liberatory, right? That we should be thinking about, like, what does it mean for us as ethnic studies educators to be data driven? What does ethnic studies data look like
Mm.
that helps guide our practice? I think like these are the questions we need to be asking so that we can begin to take back some of the stuff that's been kind of made made terrible. I really think that we have this huge opportunity to potentially redefine not just how the ethnic studies space looks, but teaching beyond, even though it's mandated, right? I think that we have to also, another thing we're going to have to work and really be prepared on is for those of us with more capacity, experience, and history in the work is creating accessible resources for those who are entering into it and having some patience for them to make mistakes. Um, and that's going to happen. So I think that and that's going to be, I think that it's best handled at the site level. If you've
Mhm.
got teachers who kind of point people, and as other teachers are kind of coming in, there are resources available to them so that there is a baseline minimum level of what people can do, that's kind of hard to get wrong. I don't like that. So that means that there's some level of standardization, but I think that that can also free some teachers who are newer to this work into doing it in a way to where they can build. And I think that that has to be part of this conversation as well. How do those of us who are really committed to it help apprentice those who may kind of fall into teaching ethnic studies and then they come to love it?
Yeah.
I think that that's also part of this game.
Well, I already have like a bunch of questions that I want to ask as follow-ups, but I think I want to be respectful of your time and of the time of the educators here. So I'm going to wrap us up here, but I want to thank you for taking your time out to meet with us and be in conversation and just to show you some appreciation. So thank you for doing all this. This is helpful for us, and we know that this is not the end of the conversation at the beginning, but we have a beginning, and that feels good. So thank you for sharing. I was about to ask, is there a way that we can follow up with you?
Yeah, emails in chat. You can also just Google me and you can find my find the email. I'm at UC Berkeley. But yes, the email and chat. Feel free anytime. Just say you're in the Zoom thing we're in.
Well, fair enough.